So given that I realised that Stephen was obviously going to take a more detailed view of this, and coming later, Crystal will do something similar from the Orc Services perspective. And given the fact that I'm, as Alistair and I were just discussing earlier, we're in the privileged position of actually having summaries of all these reports given to us, and so therefore we get the pre-seed version of all of this. I'm going to come at this from the educated victim sort of perspective, as opposed to sort of going into great detail on some of this, and maybe just give an overview of how some of the exchanges may view this. And as my boss Andreas Preuss was quoted as saying last week, in Chicago, was we continue to monitor with interest, I suppose, the optimization of the disimprovement of the marketplace with respect to the implementation of MiFID II. So therefore, with respect to that, I suppose one of the first questions I would actually ask is, for those of you that were involved with MiFID I, how many of you actually thought that MiFID I was an improvement actually in the market? Okay, so you don't count because you've got a vested interest. So I think there's a deafening roar there in terms of the number of hands that went up, which kind of questions as to whether some of the regulations that are coming through actually are an improvement in the marketplace, and whether, I suppose, the stated aim that competition is good has necessarily actually created better markets or not. So we'll just throw that one out there as a general comment. As somebody would say, yeah, you might think that I couldn't possibly comment. But if we look at, I suppose, the way that we've approached the MiFID project in general, we've tended to try and cluster some of the various different elements that we've been looking at here. So if we look in the bottom left-hand corner, I suppose we're looking at elements which is with respect to the implementation and compliance thereof, either from ourselves as an exchange entity and or yourselves as member firms, institutions, and these are the kind of things that have to be implemented just to keep the lights on and ensure that we're actually complying. So fortunately, again, from my perspective, I don't have to deal with those issues. So therefore we have a number of different areas down in that bottom left-hand corner with respect to just ensuring that there's implementation of a number of these. Already, Stephen, if we go further up into the left top corner, we look at the trade reporting, transaction reporting. From our perspective, on a systems perspective, it's non-trivial to say the least with respect to some of the new requirements that will actually be put in there. And of course, that will be similar for you as member firms as well at the same point in time. And as Stephen and I were discussing earlier, I suppose if there is one of the areas that would need a delay, given that that's what we potentially have coming ahead of us, some of the implementation of things like the transaction and trade reporting are areas which may cause the most delay, just in terms of looking at what's required for everybody to actually implement. Then, of course, there's a lot of work still to be done. And of course, from that perspective, we as Deutsche Börse Group also view that as something of an opportunity. I'm sure a number of you are aware that we sponsor Registr, that we bought Impendium, which is a cloud-based service with respect to transactional reporting, etc. So our market data and services guys actually have a number of different areas where they provide services to the marketplace with respect to that. If we then go into the HFT and the algo side, I suppose to a certain extent, we've been through the pain already from a Deutsche Börse perspective, and you as the community be aware that with the HFT laws that came in Germany, then at least from that perspective, we've been through some of the work involved in this already, so we have an advantage, if you want to call it that, in terms of some of the other exchanges in having to deal with some of these issues already. I think the issue going further forward, though, will be that whereas in that particular instance, BaFin kind of received the hospital pass from the politicians, and therefore we're in a position whereby they were perhaps more open to working with us in terms of working out what the requirements may be. And so therefore we came up with the 4 pillars, as it were, with respect to what classified as a HFT firm. And so therefore it was quite clear to everybody that if they hit all 4 boxes, they were HFT, and therefore had to adhere. If they wanted to work around the system, then perhaps they wouldn't have a 10 gig line, or they wouldn't do colo, or they wouldn't do 75,000 transactions, or wherever the case may be. Under the new jurisdiction, of course, it won't be quite as simple as that. So therefore, even though we may have been one step ahead of the game in some of that, we'll probably be in the same situation as everybody else from that perspective in terms of trying to work out what's there. I suppose what concerns us as an exchange more, though, then, is if I start joining some of these clusters together. So if I took the HFT piece, which is kind of in the middle here on the algo, with respect to the third country firm authorization, and link that also into the market making, we now have this conglomeration which says, okay, so where is a large amount of liquidity in our markets coming from at this point in time? Of course, we know that it's coming from HFT algo type activities. At the same point in time, we know that X amount of that liquidity then also comes from third country entities, so let's call them trading firms coming from Chicago. And we also know that there will be new requirements now, and Stephen just mentioned, in terms of anybody that's accessing a market from a DMA perspective, particularly here in the UK. Of course, the FCA has sponsored the idea of the local type regulation. There's a lot of proprietary trading firms that currently sit under arcade type structures that weren't regulated entities, that of course now will have to become regulated entities. And then when they become regulated entities, they will then obviously have to adhere to the capital directives that are required. So there's a whole kind of ball game there with respect to nobody's quite sure what it is that they will be required to do. Nobody's sure what capital they would be required. I mean, we spoke to one particular proprietary trading group, and their view was that under how they read the current terms, they would probably have to need capital of 2 billion. And of course, the suggestion was we don't have that. So now we're going to move into a world where maybe some of the liquidity provision that was out there will perhaps dry up, because some of those guys will have to actually look for alternative ways of accessing the market, or they'll also become taxi drivers, or whatever the case may be, as some of the ex-locals on the live trading floor were. So that, for us, that's a real concern. And then Stephen also touched on some of the systematic internalization, OTF sort of pieces. I suppose if I link the systematic internalization with respect to market making, we see on the cash equity sides now, of course, the fact that you will have to adhere to some sort of market making status, particularly if you're a HFT algo type firm. And therefore you will have to stay in the market in good times as well as bad, or bad times as well as good, I should say. Whereas under the systematic internalization rules, then of course actually people operating in those markets will not have to stay in the marketplace at those points in time. We think there's certainly an arbitrage, as it were, with respect to the way that the regulation's coming out on that. And also the idea, particularly on the cash equity world, that there will be various different tick sizes that will be allowed on smaller increments with respect to the systematic internalization world relative to the exchange world. Also then perhaps provides an opportunity, shall we call it, for people that are in the systematic internalization environment. I think then you'll find that probably some people will look at just thinking about the market making as well from that perspective. What will also be non-trivial for us is that if we now look at it from a derivatives world point of view, we as an exchange will have to monitor all high frequency trading activity. So if it's a a Bund or a Eurostox, where we wouldn't claim that we required official market-making capacity in the past. Now, of course, people will be market makers by virtue of their activities. Therefore, we as an exchange will have to monitor those activities. That means lots of big data projects, I'm sure, going on within the exchange for the next couple of years to try and adhere to all of this as well. So the sooner the quantum computer sort of type guys get their act together, probably the better as we go further forward on some of this. But in looking at the new world now, what does it mean with respect to, we kind of know what it means on the cash equity world and what happened with MTFs and systematic internalizers. Some people's view is that systematic internalizers haven't really had as much of the business as they had in the past, or what was there and what was available to them hasn't been utilized to the full extent. With this differential in tick sizes now, that may actually change the landscape. But I think in a derivatives perspective, it'll be interesting to see how some of these things are applied. And if I look at it from my perspective, and obviously we're moving much more now into the top right, I suppose the way we view it is the bottom left is the pain, the bottom of the top right should be the gain. It's a gain potentially for market participants, but in certain instances, of course, now the exchanges and clearinghouses will also have to view it like that, and some of it will, I suppose, be the if you can't beat them, join them sort of strategy. And there's perhaps two ways of looking at that going further forward then. An obvious way of viewing that, which we've already implemented to a certain extent, is the idea of the clearinghouses acting as a link into the OTFs, for example, and effectively just allowing OTFs then to feed the trade flow off of their trading platforms into a clearing environment. So we at Eurex have already started that with what we call the TCPs, trade capture platforms, where non-member entities can already feed business through into a Eurex environment, rather than going through a lot of acronyms, effectively put it in the parking lot, and once it hits the parking lot, then the member firms can actually accept the transactions, and so at that point in time, that's the point of execution. So the additional benefits of that potentially, of course, are that if that's the point of execution, it's then an exchange trade under the exchange rules and regulations, and so therefore that may have the benefit of 2-day margin versus 5-day, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, some of the other areas, I suppose, that we would see then is perhaps we as exchanges should also be offering trading venues ourselves with respect to OTFs. So one might argue that the Curve platform that's being offered at this point in time is an example of an institutionalized systematic internalizer, or some form of OTF sort of type ability for those market participants, obviously going further forward. So we'll be obviously watching with interest as to what happens there, but again, we come back to the if you can't beat them, join them sort of strategy. Where does all of this go? Yeah, whether it's that, with respect to the concerns that are there, when it comes down to transparency, if we link that in, some of the block trade sizes effectively that will be allowed under the new regime. If we look at the Bund Bubble Schatz as examples today with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 lots, the principle was that you put large block trade sizes up there by virtue of the fact that you want to instill central limit order book activity. The regulation is pushing it down towards low block trade threshold levels, would appear to be what we see, which actually just panders towards systematic internalization and OTFs. And then, of course, we also have to look at the pricing issue as to whether then, in the old days, of course, it was a case of trading was king, and that's where most of the exchanges' fees would come from. Nowadays, clearing may be viewed as king. We still have a consolidated fee with respect to trading and clearing, I suppose the more recent view of that was ICE. So if we looked at the more traditional exchanges, it was always the fact that the trading fee was probably 90% of the fee, and clearing was 5 to 10% maybe. In the new regime that ICE has put in place, the clearing piece is a much bigger chunk, and now the trading is actually more down towards the 10 to 20%. So the world is shifting from that perspective. We have to look at that as well, and obviously we then have to look at the access issue and essentially who it is that may request access to the clearinghouse, for example. To me, all of these things, if you add them all up, with respect to the pain on the implementation and some of the aspects that are just outlined, even if there is some potential gain, I go back to my question at the beginning as to who thought that there was a real benefit from MiFID I. My concern, and I can say that as myself, but I'm sure from an exchange perspective in general, and that's all exchanges, the view could be that we end up with a scenario where the liquidity that's available to the marketplace is going to be much lower than it has been in the past. If you add on top of that all of the issues that the banks are facing with respect to leverage ratios, risk-weighted assets, blah, 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 there's a real concern here. I think that we find ourselves in an environment where what was supposed to be an improvement is actually the continued optimization of disimprovement.